The premise here is that you have a case in which an officer perishes in line of duty, and there's going to be a trial, there's going to be a suspect later. So in many cases that doesn't happen. The suspect's dead, they can't, there's no suspect, it was a solo vehicle collision or something, but this is the particular case, like Detective Rafferty, for example. So it's very, very important that we're able to support both the family through that process, and it is a process, as well as the coworkers. And typically the focus is on one or the other, sometimes neither, and it's pretty accessible to do both, and there's huge gains. That's why we should be doing this. So when we're talking about providing this support during the trial, this first bullet suggests the liaison officer should continue the role. I've seen both ways. Sometimes that's not practical for that liaison officer to do that. If that fits, great. And if it doesn't, that's not really a concern. The important thing is that there is someone who is a liaison for the results of the trial. Because as we know, well before you get to a trial, there's many hearings and starts and stops and so on and so forth before you actually get to the trial date. Things get postponed, there's prelims, there's all this kind of stuff. So this liaison officer, what we try to do is we'll try to have either like the commanding officer or executive officer of the command take an ownership level to be informed with the prosecuting attorney's office and the family, and because it's this part about keeping the family updated isn't really a heavy lift, but it gives some contact to more senior management and gives them an opportunity to directly serve that family, particularly in cases where a lot of times you have other people at rank and file and so on that are doing that. That may or may not fit your particular situation, but it's just an opportunity or something to consider. The key though is that in keeping them up to date, that's not a substitute for advocating, just like with the medical, for the doctor, the nurse to talk to the family at the hospital visit or during the hospital after the person's pronounced or they're on some critical life support or something. But in the same way, I think what best practice looks like is that you facilitate as an agency, you facilitate the communication between the prosecutor and the family. So what this might look like, in probably your cases, you're working the case. It's occasional that we can have a line of duty death as the state patrol, and it actually occurred, let's say, within a city jurisdiction. They might take that as the primary handle. So we may not be the prosecuting agency. Often we are, most often. But when we have been, we will, like when I had lost an officer in a different one, I took the case down with our chief investigator. He kind of presented the case to the DA, the binders and so on, and I went there as the chief essentially to show my support and my engagement, to communicate by my presence and a couple of questions that this is important to our department because it's important to me. We came out of there, and one of my only ask on my end after we talked about the particulars of the case is when would you be able to sit down with the family and engage them about the prosecution? And fortunately, we have a great prosecutor. The particular prosecutor is like, let's set that up. And what we did is then we facilitated that communication to where the spouse could ask questions and get a presentation directly from the prosecutor in terms of the strength of the case and some of the potential pitfalls. And even if there's some decision making that needs to happen in terms of, once in a while these things are plea bargained, sometimes for good reason. And that spouse needs to be intimately involved in that entire process. So this is where it's really important. So if you're the investigating agency, you can do what Madeline was talking about, like the judge did with that one spouse that showed her the least offensive pictures. So in this one case that I'm mentioning, it was a younger spouse. Her husband was a motorcycle officer, and he was killed in a motorcycle crash during a pursuit. And when we had the investigation together to brief her, I knew that we actually had video of him going down, and he kind of slid and then he struck a fixed object. And it's kind of stomach turning in terms of, it's unpleasant to watch because you're literally watching the moment the human loses his life. And so understandably, I was extremely reluctant to show that to her. But the principle is always to give the spouse as much control over things as possible. And so I explained this, the detective gave her this big presentation. It really came down to, once her questions were answered, about crime scene photos and pictures and so on. And so we did the same thing as we teach these slides, and I hadn't had this class, as we started with least offensive photos and some video from the early part, surveillance video from the early part of the incident, and then we walked through. And then when it got to a point, I interjected and I said, look, this is some really, really tough stuff. And I said, I'm a veteran cop, and it's hard for me to watch. And I said, what you see cannot be unseen. So you need to understand, because she was really pressing hard, I said, you need to understand that if you decide to see this, I will let you, but you can never unsee this. And is that really what you want? Is that how do you want those images, and so on and so forth? So we engaged in a conversation for not a few minutes. At the end of it, I was convinced that she was very clear-eyed and had thought through, and it was her decision. So I'm going to treat her like an adult, consistent with these principles. So I said, okay, here goes. And instead of watching the video, I watched her. And at that point that I was describing, she actually recoiled. She kind of turned away, and then she goes, okay, I never want to see that again. And I said, I'm so sorry. She goes, no. She goes, I'm really, really glad that I saw that. For her, that was the right answer. For another spouse, that would have been absolutely the wrong answer. And I maintain a relationship with her, my wife and I do, and she's never, ever second-guessed that, had any kind of long-term, effect of that. But she actually, in that moment, because of that response of her choice and seeing that, she actually kind of got upset at her late husband, because she was inferring by what she saw that he had a level of carelessness or recklessness to it. And it actually provided an unexpected pivot moment, because her belief at that point, we were able to really say, no, that's actually not the case, and here's why. He was being a really good officer and a good writer, and we were able to explain everything and what went into it in some great detail. So I'm giving you a specific example. Your example obviously is going to be different, your case. But that built relationship, it empowered her. And again, in that case, because we carefully walked her through and we empowered her, it's had a good outcome. I can think of probably, that's maybe 10% of the cases where the spouse, if you really give that admonition, where you get to that point, would really want to go through with it. But with her, that was the right decision. And that's why that you can't do this stuff by formula. You have to do it by a lot of conversation and using your wisdom and discernment. So the last bullet, though, is you can't be overly protective. And my instinct was to protect her, because she's probably about the age, she could be my daughter. And I have those instincts, kind of the father-grandfather instincts at this stage over the last few years. And I was thinking of that, like if it was my daughter, but I go, this isn't my daughter. This is one of my officer's wife. I had a great deal of respect for him, and I'm not going to be overly protective once we give them the warnings. So that can help, because what you don't want to do, whether you're preparing information or it's coming from the prosecutor, you don't want to get them into trial and have them surprised by something. So it says kept informed of the DA. Again, when it really comes down and we're kind of getting to maybe a plea, you want the family and the prosecutor to be interacting directly. You can be right there with them, and you can facilitate understanding and conversation, but ultimately they've got to live with whatever that decision. A lot of agencies get cross-threaded because the agency has a view and the agency has an opinion of what they want, and that may not exactly agree with what the spouse wants. What we teach consistently is who breaks the tie on that. It's their loved one. And for some of us in the agency, because we're so heavily into the agency perspective, that's an uncomfortable thought, because we don't want to lose the control, and we know politically it may hurt us, or these type of things. But the spouse, the spouse rules. I wouldn't get to that point if there's a disagreement. I wouldn't just get to that simply. I'd have a lot of conversation and engagement, and I'd explain where the agency is coming from, and I'd certainly listen more than even explain. But at the end of the day, when all the discussion's taken place, if it really comes to that, then you're going to support the spouse. That last bullet, the spouse gets to decide. We obviously would encourage family to attend the trial. Many you don't have to encourage. Nothing would keep them away from it. So it's not so much you need to encourage them, it's just that you need to make allowance for that. We will assign peer support to officers and the family throughout the trial, so we'll have a certain ratio for every one of our officers that wants to go. If officers are in a particular station or in associate stations that really knew this or invested in that officer, we will generally move heaven and earth to give them duty time and adjust schedules and so on so that they can attend the trial. In some cases where we knew the courtroom was limited, we knew they couldn't even get into court, but they wanted to go down there and just be outside and be together. And we said, let's make it happen. And that has paid a tremendous benefit in terms of their trust of leadership and morale. And then the victim assistance professionals, often those get left out because we're so invested as an agency. We forget that a lot of times the prosecutor's office will have a victim assistance unit, and the city or the county will. And our families, although we're not going to just kick them over to the victim assistance unit, often they have benefits and resources that we don't even consider firsthand. Maybe we're aware and we would refer another crime victim to that, but we don't think about it for them, and they can actually be a very, very useful resource. So we already talked about this, giving time off as needed, doing critical incident stress debriefs following the trial. You can make a judgment on that, either to offer it. When we do critical incident stress debriefs, by the way, following a line of duty death, those are organized according to kind of groups. So we might have the officers who were at a scene be a part of a group. We might have officers who have a certain relationship with the officer who weren't at the scene be a part of the group. My wife is often in the spouse group, so we'll have a group just for spouses. One of the interesting things we're involved with is the surviving spouse sheep. Oh, did I lose it? Did my battery die? I think my battery died. Let's pull this up. So the surviving spouse who had just been a part of that group, of course, before her husband died, wanted to join that, and that's not recommended, and the captain didn't do a good job of explaining that, so she ended up kind of joining the group, and the effect that had is all these other spouses who came in there, and they're really struggling. They're struggling over the loss of the officer. They're struggling over almost like a survivor's guilt of their own. Like they feel guilty that their husband's still alive while their friend lost her. And that's a forum that they can express those feelings and get those framed with a mental health professional and get some peer support and referrals and so on. And that opportunity got contaminated because of that. So obviously we want to get people in like circumstance. Dispatch is another group that can be included, or sometimes if it was the dispatcher, we'll include the dispatcher even in the scene group. There's no direct formula for that. Usually you get together with the mental health professionals, some of your senior peer people, and you figure out the best construction of that. Every time is a little different, but there's some principles that guide us. And so depending upon the outcome of the trial, you might want to offer some critical incident stress debriefs so just people can work through any remaining feelings. Even if the outcome was optimal, unideal, because many times people will get to the end of the trial phase, the individual will be found guilty, get a max sentence, and people find at the end of that road they were expecting that it would, in some non-specific sense, that it would provide relief or a sense of justice. And many people who get to that point say it's the most empty or worst part of the whole journey, because they realize that although we got justice from the criminal justice system in terms of a max sentence, they were putting a lot of their healing into a verdict, and no verdict is going to bring back your coworker, your loved one, and so on. And they come to that hard moment in which they realize, life feels really empty right now. So offering a CISD for that can be super helpful. Let's see. So this applies to every aspect of everything we've said. If you're under-resourced, and I realize who we're talking to here, this is like the least likely group to apply this generally, but if in any way you find yourself under-resourced for any aspect, any single aspect, let alone a whole deal, ask for help. And Madeline mentioned earlier about agencies reaching out, because some states like Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and so on that we get to travel to, they have wonderful teams that do pretty much every funeral in the state for line of duty death. But even if that's not the case, or you hear of a smaller agency, maybe you know people, you know cops, it's really nice to be able to help them either informally or formally.